Sweden is nowadays a pretty nice place. You can buy cheap furniture from IKEA, and if you hurt your thumb assembling it, your free healthcare nurses you back. At the hospital, you also get a free bowl of meatballs and a state-mandatory tall, blonde girlfriend. You ask your best buddy Sven what war is. He says he doesn't know. He only knows peace, friendship, and Mayflower poles. Then he sells a JAS Gripen airplane to foreign military powers and makes a whoopload of cash. Things were a bit different 300 years ago. There were no meatballs, only bark bread. Your blonde girlfriend was burnt at the stake for being a witch. And you? You got conscripted into the army and sent off to kill Germans and Polacks. Because if it's something the Swedes were good at, it was destroying other countries. Germany was left a smoking ruin by Swedish hands. The Polish to this day sing songs about that one time Swedish troops killed more Poles than World War II. Russia needed 20 years and sweeping reforms to defeat a country with a population 10 times smaller. This period of Swedish history is commonly called the Swedish Empire. Sweden was at the height of its territorial extent, owning a bit of land here and here and here, and there. Its most powerful control, however, was over the Baltic Sea. This dominion was called the Domini Mares Baltici, and allowed Sweden to rake in fat stacks of cash from the wealthy Baltic trade. One of the prime goals of my channel is to explore how Baltic trade conflicts affected the flow of European history. However, Sweden's status as an empire might be a tad excessive. Sweden was never able to dominate global trade like the Dutch, or decide European politics like the French. During the 17th century, Sweden was dependent on French subsidies. France often used Sweden as a rabid attack dog to kill its enemies, but didn't treat their ally any better than a small German prince. Sweden itself was a cold and barren country full of poor farmers and fishermen. Yet, somehow, these farmers became some of Europe's best disciplined soldiers, and the fishermen turned into a navy that could rule the Baltic. Somehow, a country of less than 3 million people was able to punch far, far above its weight. Most credit is given to Gustavus Adolphus and his mighty army. Sure, the army helped, but a professional modern army didn't just come out of nowhere. And sure, Gustavus did a lot of things, but only thanks to the government framework created by his predecessors. Sweden had created an effective state model, which it could use to effectively harness its resources and beat the poop out of its neighbors. Those neighbors were forced to adapt, lest they fade into the annals of history. This video is not so much about Sweden's less than a century of glory, or its military exploits, but rather how a revolutionary bureaucracy was able to shape European history and the foundation of modern states. Historian Jan Glete described early modern Sweden as a fiscal military state. A fiscal military state is a 20th century definition for an early modern government where a centralized state is able to effectively organize its resources into a professional, standing army. This standing army is then used to defend, expand, and control society. Let's put it into simpler terms and simultaneously apply this concept into practice. Sweden in the late Middle Ages was a mess. In other European countries, such as England or France, the nobility was strong. They had small private armies and castles to defend their lands from invaders. In Sweden, the nobility was weak. Most of the land was owned by free peasants. Peasant communities were able to organize themselves into militias that could easily defend their forested homeland from invaders, but couldn't attack cities or go on foreign expeditions. Sweden in the 1400s saw a lot of wars and internal strife. The country was ruled by a Danish king, and the Swedes repeatedly made attempts to break free. If you lived on the border with Denmark, having your farm destroyed by German mercenaries was an everyday event. Production and trade was largely handled by a foreign conglomerate of German merchants, known as the Hansa. The Hansa maintained its own navy and a private army of mercenaries. Since they didn't need anyone defending them, the king was unable to impose large taxes on them. If the Swedes displeased the Hansa, they could impose trade embargoes, severely hurting the economy and people's daily lives. For example, one such trade embargo led to a shortage of salt, which was vital for food preservation and as a stable nutrition. What Sweden wanted was a strong, centralized state that could come in, defend the country against military invasions, and protect the economy against trade embargoes. Now, it's really much easier to sell something if people really want what's being offered. If I have a lot of Swedish meatballs, I can't just force people to be hungry and want them. It's much easier for me to go to a bunch of hungry people and sell to them. So if a country is peaceful and stable, they don't want an absolute government enforcing heavy taxes on them. But in a country like Renaissance Sweden, which was plagued by violence and economic strife, there was a demand for a fiscal military state, a professional army and a centralized government. A similar situation had arisen in late medieval Spain. The advent of gunpowder and heavy artillery had rendered medieval castles obsolete. Local aristocrats could no longer protect themselves against foreign invaders, such as France, the Ottoman Turks, or even their own king. Suddenly there rose a demand for a centralized state and a professional military to defend the country. Thus, the recently united Trastamara dynasty set up an effective bureaucracy that was able to effectively organize the country's resources into a professional army, the tercios, and a standing navy of galleys. The Spanish government wasn't a dictatorship that robbed its people of resources. Fiscal military states are all about cooperation. The aristocracy wanted to be defended, so they willingly gathered resources and gave it to the government. In return, they were given lucrative job opportunities in the administration and army. A similar situation arose in the Netherlands, which wasn't even a monarchy. The Netherlands was essentially a grassroots movement, where the merchant elite and citizenry shared a demand for mutual protection against Spain. By effectively gathering and organizing the resources together, a small country of Dutchmen was able to beat back the mighty Spanish Empire and become a global naval hegemon. Anyway, back to Sweden. Civil strife culminated in the Stockholm bloodbath, when the Danish king executed a large number of aristocrats and clergymen. One of the surviving nobles, Gustav Vasa, rallied the Swedish peasantry and liberated the country. Since the peasant militias couldn't form an effective offensive force, Gustav hired mercenaries and a navy from the Hansa. In return, he would give them future tax income and increased trading rights. With their help, Gustav was able to drive out the Danes and was elected King of Sweden in 1523. Now what had to be done? Sweden needed a standing army to defend itself from invaders. Sweden needed a navy to defend its trade from embargoes. Most trade was seaborne from the Baltic. And to finance these efforts, Sweden needed money. There wasn't exactly a huge surplus of cash, since Sweden was a poor agricultural country with a small population of less than 1 million inhabitants. Well, Gustav didn't have any other choice and had to find an effective way of collecting taxes. Since the nobility was severely weakened, Gustav established local administrations run by bailiffs that directly negotiated with peasant communities. They compiled registers of all the farms in their district and the taxes they should pay. Armed men helped them collect taxes and enforced law and order. State propaganda was also spread through the bailiffs, ensuring the population's compliance. Since most bailiffs were ambitious men of non-aristocratic origin, Gustav had created a direct link of loyalty between royal society and local society. Those that made a successful career in the king's service could expect an appointment as a local judge, a prestigious position previously only held by aristocrats. Though later changes were made to the bureaucracy in later years, the system did not change too much and was still based on the administrative framework established by our boy GV. Okay, so in the next parts of the video I'm going to go through the various facets of society and systems which Gustav Vasa implemented or reformed. I will then explain how they developed throughout the age of the Swedish Empire. Though these systems did develop, they were only able to do so thanks to Gustav's initial efforts. In this section, I'll discuss the role of the Swedish nobility. Whilst Gustav Vasa had pretty much circumnavigated the nobility's role in his administration, they would rise to prominence in the 1600s. The 1600s saw the rise of Sweden as a major political player, and this is largely attributed to the leadership of Gustavus Adolphus. However, he began his rule during childhood and was subject to a regency council of aristocrats. In other countries, these nobles would have decentralized the country and increased their own power, like they did in Spain during the 1600s, for example. Instead, the aristocrats full-heartedly supported the government machine. But why? Because they were poor. Feudalism had never existed in Sweden. Not in the Middle Ages, not in the 1600s. Most land was owned by free peasants. A centralized state dominated by the nobility allowed them the possibility of a regular income. They desired participation in the government. They would serve in high offices of state, such as heads of the army, the treasury, judges, and provincial governors. In the 17th century, aristocrats would be preferred as officers and civil servants. This might seem like a backtrack, and indeed, noble administrators were immune to dismissal or punishment without due process. However, it was largely a reaction to Gustav Vasa's government, which had often treated its servants arbitrarily. Gustav Vasa was really not a nice guy. The fiscal military state allowed 17th century Sweden to effectively wage wars of expansion and plunder, earning the nobles considerable revenue and prestige. They became a warrior aristocracy that made their wealth through bloodshed. One Swedish noble told his son, "Just take, my son, as much as you might, for he that takes, he has." But it's not like they were cowards. They led their men from the front lines. Per capita, more Swedish nobles fell in battle than non-nobles. Government participation also allowed civil servants to become nobility, and for foreigners to become landed nobility. During the 30 Years' War, many Germans in Swedish service would gain land and power this way. These Germans treated their Swedish subjects like they had their own serfs back home, as in, very poorly. Since the government needed money, they would sell crown property across the empire to the nobility, further increasing their power. After establishing his bureaucracy, Gustav Vasa became the first sovereign monarch to adopt Protestantism. Not due to any personal devotions, rather for Machiavellian ambitions of personal power. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church claimed the right of taxation in Sweden. It had its own laws, and bishops were members of the governmental council. Their network of local priests allowed them to support social cohesion or raise opposition to the government. They were a major political unit. So, by cutting ties with the Pope, Gustav Vasa was able to eliminate this rival and confiscate their property. Monasteries and churches were plundered. Books were torn apart and used for wadding in cannons. Bells were melted down and used to settle his debts with the Hansa. He even stole furniture for his own palace. A state church became vital for the established administration. In the coming decades and centuries, local priests were used for collecting taxes, keeping records of local society, and perhaps most importantly, spreading propaganda. Swedish society became fanatically religious. Sunday masses could be hours long, and peasants were taught how to read so they could read the Bible. If you missed mass, you were punished. The local priests yearly interviewed peasant families on their Bible knowledge, and faulty answers could lead to punishments. During the 1600s, the conflicts in Europe were pitched as wars to defend the Protestant religion against the Catholics. When the war took its toll and bad harvests starved the peasants, the church could blame society's faults on witchcraft. Some old women, too old to pay taxes anyway, were sentenced to death on absurd charges. So during the reign of Gustav Vasa, the peasantry saw increased taxes and the collapse of their traditional religion. How did they react? There were several uprisings, though Gustav Vasa's experience with handling the peasantry allowed him to effectively suppress them using both stick and carrot. But as a whole, his efforts to pacify the populace were surprisingly effective. His most effective argument was the fact that he was able to safeguard the country from internal strife, foreign invasions, and economic blockades. This was true, and so convincing, that it remained the talking point of the Swedish propaganda machine for the next 100 years, even when Sweden waged blatant wars of imperial expansionism. In the 1600s, when Swedish conscripts were sent off to die in Poland or Germany, the clergy still convinced them that this was in defense of their homeland. Whilst the peasantry did bear the brunt of Sweden's wartime miseries, they weren't oppressed in a direct manner. Feudalism was non-existent, there were no serfs, and the peasantry even had representation in the parliament. During the 1600s, there was no civil wars, no rebellions, just a few riots with low levels of violence. Rather, the peasants willingly gave their resources to the government and willingly cooperated. Large numbers of young men were conscripted into the army, and the state trusted them enough to give them weapons to train with, something very rare in European context. It wasn't until the late 1600s that the Swedish peasantry became opposed to foreign wars and conscription. The imperial conflicts had created a new collective memory of soldiers, brothers, sons and fathers that went out and never returned. Charles XI used this to his advantage when he created absolutist rule with the consent of the peasantry. Conscription was abolished and a volunteer army was established. the Karelians. In the mid-18th century, the Swedish peasantry revolted against the parliament. This almost sparked a Swedish revolution, with the goal to establish an elected but absolute monarch. With his loyal peasantry, church and regular tax income, Vasa was able to establish a standing navy. Gustav's navy was administered by the state, built and maintained by state-operated shipyards, and commanded by a permanent officer corps. This was revolutionary. During the Middle Ages, fleets were temporary things, consisting of legalized pirates and levied merchantmen. Gustav was also one of the first kings to construct ships armed primarily with heavy cannons able to sink other ships. Sweden's seafaring community consisted of fishermen and local traders, so this investment was a huge testament to the ability of a pretty backward society to organize its limited resources. In 1534, Sweden militarily intervened against the Hansa, eliminating them as an economic and political power in the Baltic. Sweden was now able to dominate Baltic trade. So my first video ever was about the Crown, a Swedish flagship which just blew up before battle even started. I mentioned in that video that Sweden was largely incompetent as a naval power, which isn't exactly true. It's kinda true if you compare Sweden to more competent naval powers like Denmark or the Netherlands. Everyone else in the Baltic was even more incompetent than Sweden. The Germans, Poles and Russians had poor, decentralized governments that were unable to or disinterested in gathering the necessary resources to build up standing navies. Thus, Sweden was able to run roughshod in the Baltic. They could blockade ports, transport troops and control trade. It allowed them to raise custom duties in controlled ports and sell license to merchants. Sweden was, above all, a Baltic empire, and the sea was its highway. When Peter the Great set about reforming Russian society, one of his major goals was establishing a Russian navy that could rival the Swedes. His goal of the war was to secure Baltic ports for Russia, and his new capital became a Baltic seaport. However, even in the 18th century, the Russian navy was repeatedly matched by the Swedes, even when commanded by Dutch or English admirals. Even though the Swedish populace were scared of foreign invasions and economic blockade, Sweden and Scandinavia has great geographic defenses. Most of it is just forests, hills and mountains. Occupying Sweden and Finland is largely impossible. The only people that were really under threat from ravaging armies were those in the border regions with Denmark and Russia. Sweden itself has never once been militarily occupied. Anyway, this rough geography is why the navy and the sea were so important. Like I said, the Baltic Sea was Sweden's highway. During the Middle Ages, European armies consisted of feudal cavalry, peasant militias and mercenaries. The feudal cavalry were highly trained, but an elite corps low in number that grew increasingly obsolete in the 1500s. Peasant militias were good for defensive operations, but they were poor in offensive campaigns and would only fight periodically, before seasonally returning home to tend to their farms. Mercenaries were professional soldiers that offered their services to the highest bidder. They were good fighters, but were expensive and still dependent on central administration, and they lacked any loyalties. Most countries were reliant on these patchwork armies well into the 1600s. Denmark had no peacetime army until the mid-1600s, and was reliant on German mercenaries to wage war. Neither were battlefield tactics as important as some historians hyped them up to be. During the early stages of the 30 Years' War, Protestant armies using revolutionary Dutch tactics were beat up by Catholic armies still employed in the Spanish tercios. Cohesion, organization and supply was more important than tactics. Gustav Vasa reformed the peasant militia into a conscription system, where a quota of able-bodied men were selected to serve in times of war. Recruits were registered by the bailiffs and given training, weapons, payment and a command structure. They weren't really good at offensive warfare, though decent enough to hold back Sweden's enemies, and win some minor concessions in Livonia. However, Gustav Vasa had created a standing peacetime army, a monopoly of violence, and a framework for latter kings to evolve. It wasn't until Gustavus Adolphus that a proper offensive army was established. The lack of feudal traditions and established structures made it easier for him to pass reforms, though it wouldn't have been possible without Gustav Vasa's framework. National regiments were permanently organized. Every company of 130 men had 13 officers, allowing for increased discipline and flexible performance. Logistics and payment was also incredibly important. Since the Swedes earned a steady wage, they didn't have to spread out over large areas to collect provisions or plunder. Civilian and military administrations worked closely together to manage recruitment and conscription. In 1623, Sweden had a population of roughly 1.25 million. 3.5% of those were employed in the army or navy, which is huge. In France, it was only 1%. However, in the Dutch Republic, it was 5%. Of course, if Sweden was to find any imperial success, it needed a much bigger army. During the 1600s, it became reliant on mercenary regiments. But so were other countries, without finding the same success. This is because the Swedes were able to use the same administration and bureaucracy implemented in their standing army on the mercenaries. Thus, they were able to maintain the same effectiveness. The mercenaries were a supplement and weren't essential to the core competencies of the Swedish army. Sweden has traditionally been an elective monarchy. Kings were often deposed by aristocrats and foreign competitors. In 1544, Gustav Vasa induced the parliament to make the monarchy hereditary, meaning that the crown passed from father to son. Whilst this was a move to strengthen his own bloodline, the Vasa dynasty proved remarkably competent. 6 generations with a total of 10 rulers, from 1523 to 1718, provided Sweden with skilled kings. These included 3 of the best European generals in their time, Gustavus Adolphus, Charles X and Charles XII. The ones that were inferior military commanders proved excellent administrators. In domestic affairs, most of them were efficient in handling both the peasantry and the nobility. The early Vasas were brilliant propagandists and rhetorics. Gustav Vasa is said to have written more personal letters than any Swede in history. Gustavus Adolphus was known for his rallying speeches and charisma. All in all, the effective managing of Sweden was a dynastic effort that lasted for generations. The kings actively participated in the government. The king was the hard-working leader of the administration and armed forces. He took personal decisions about military organizations, tactics and armaments, appointed officers and civil servants, and insisted on detailed knowledge about the state. In the context of fiscal military states, the Vasa kings should be seen as entrepreneurs. They were protection sellers. In return for heavy taxes, they would give stability and safety with their professional army and navy. This sale of protection was primarily domestic. Swedish peasants were protected by the Swedish army and navy. However, it also worked abroad. Livonia became Swedish territory because the Livonian aristocracy desired Swedish protection. Sweden's ability to control the Baltic Sea made it much safer to travel for merchants. In the Middle Ages, as a comparison, the Baltic had been dominated by piracy and violent trade conflicts. There's a huge meme that coercion and absolutism led to the effective foundation of early modern states. France under the Sun King is usually the torchbearer of this farce, with his "I am the state" epic gamer quote. Sure, France was able to take territory from its neighbors, because it had massive resources and 20 million inhabitants. It was the largest country by far. It wasn't nearly as effective at organizing these resources as fiscal military states like the Netherlands, which was a republic. The Netherlands was able to at least hold back the French. When Spain had been established as a fiscal military state in the early 1500s, its professional army of infantry was able to sweep the floor with France's patchwork army of Swiss mercenaries and fueled cavalry. Absolutism wasn't the key to a fiscal military state. It was cooperation between interest groups and the effective organization of resources. In Sweden, all 4 major interest groups, the estates, were represented in the parliament, called Riksdag. These estates included the peasantry and nobility, which we talked about. They also included the urbanized, merchant middle class called burghers, and the church. The burghers weren't exactly powerful, since Sweden lacked large towns and cities, but they were still necessary for trade contacts around the Baltic. The church was state-controlled and dependent on the king, but had huge influence with the population, and were vital for maintaining social order and political stability. Though the parliament had medieval roots, it didn't become an integrated part of the Swedish states until the 1500s. Major decisions such as Gustav Vasa's election as king, the confiscation of church property, the change from elective to hereditary monarchy, taxation and conscription all required the consent of the broad strata if they were to be respected and implemented efficiently. Up until the 1660s, the parliament proved compliant to royal demands. The kings wanted imperialist wars to expand their power. The nobility agreed, since they were reliant on the state for power. The burghers were too weak, the church was reliant on the king, and the peasantry were easily convinced that the offensive wars abroad were really in defense of Sweden. In some sessions, the peasants were excluded from attending, such as the implementation of a heavy tax around 1613. Overall, sessions were short and votes were quick. Cooperation was more effective than coercion. For the ruling dynasty, the parliament was a vital tool in building legitimacy and a strong state. However, during the 1660s, the parliament began to realize their power. Sessions became longer and were held at regular intervals. The estates began to interfere in government activities. When Sweden collapsed as a great power and entered its age of liberty, the parliament ruled the country. Sometimes the success of Sweden in the early modern era is attributed to its large abundance in natural resources valuable for warfare. From the Middle Ages to, well, today, Sweden has been a major iron exporter. Iron was vital in the production of tools, weaponry, and the humble nail, used in everything from warships to wagons. Sweden was rich in copper mines. Copper was used as a currency, but most importantly for creating high-quality firearms and artillery. Most of Sweden is just forest, and strong lumber was vital for producing warships. Additionally, Sweden produced high-quality tar and other naval stores, which were exported across Europe. Thus, Sweden was able to establish a flourishing arms industry, not only able to export weaponry and equipment, but supply it to its own government. This gave it an advantage, but the industry was not necessary in its success. The Netherlands was much more successful than Sweden, but was reliant on imported arms and raw material. The arms industry in Sweden must be seen as a result of, rather than a precondition for, imperial expansion. It was a creation closely dependent on royal initiatives and demand from the growing armed forces. Thanks to all the preconditions discussed throughout the video, Sweden was able to rise to become a major political player in the Baltic Sea. Cooperation with the estates allowed the state to maintain support, stability, and to harvest the necessary resources to establish a strong army and navy. Due to the weakness and decentralization of its neighbors, the Germans, Russians, and Polish, Sweden was able to dominate the Baltic Sea. During the early 1600s, offensive warfare became the state's primary source of power and income. This created a really nasty cycle. The kings, aristocrats, and industry all benefited from war. The king was able to expand the prestige of the nation, which was an extension of himself. The aristocrats were able to grow their own status from administrator or military service and could plunder riches. The industry, which was almost entirely centered around armament production or the construction of ships, obviously profited from selling its produce to the government. The only losers were the aristocrats and monarchs in Sweden's neighbors, and also the Swedish peasantry, who were exposed to intense resource extraction for the sake of war. The nastiest and most embarrassing result of this cycle was Charles X's war in Poland. The 30 Years' War had created an immensely large Swedish army that was dependent on resource extraction from occupied German territory and French subsidies to fund itself. When peace came, the army wasn't able to fund itself, no matter the effective tax extraction. We saw political infighting. As a solution, Charles X decided to attack Poland on rather flimsy causes. The real goal was to plunder Poland as much as possible. Houses were stripped down and sold. Anything and everything was plunder. Pretty much all of Poland's cultural history was just carried off. Approximately 1/3 of Poland's population was killed and Warsaw was utterly destroyed. This damage was more extensive than what the Germans did in the Second World War. I mentioned before that Sweden's neighbors had to adapt its model as a fiscal military state, and I meant it. After Sweden occupied and terrorized North Germany in the 30 Years' War, German princes realized that they had to change their states to defend their sovereignty and economies. Brandenburg Prussia is the best example of a government that could adapt a state like this. During the 30 Years' War, BP was a neutral power that got bullied into becoming a Swedish puppet. In 1675, they were able to defeat the Swedish army in battle. Denmark spent much of the 17th century in constant conflict with Sweden. In the 1650s, it lost half of its core country to the Swedes and almost ceased to exist as a sovereign nation. Just like the Prussians, they adapted Swedish methods after lengthy conflicts with them, and were eventually able to defend their country, though they could never retake their lost territories. One example of a neighbor that failed to adapt the Swedish model was Poland-Lithuania. Whereas the various interest groups in Prussia, Denmark, and Sweden were able to cooperate in organizing resources and establishing a professional army, the Poles were unable to do this. The local elites remained too powerful and disinterested in aiding the government. they were repeatedly weakened from wars with its neighbors, before finally being partitioned by Prussia, Russia and Austria in the mid-1700s. That's not to demean the bravery of the Polish soldiers and civilians. Individual tenacity has never been the fault of any country at war, ever. What matters in civilizational conflicts is cooperation and the effective organization of resources. After a lengthy war with Sweden in the early 1700s, Russia was able to build a fiscal military state of its own. This was sort of similar to the Dutch Republic, which had developed its fiscal military state after conflict with the Spanish. Russia took away most of Sweden's Baltic possessions. After this lengthy war, most Swedes were just tired. The government had lost interest in war, and the parliament took power. They divided themselves into quarreling parties, and all unity was lost. Sweden had lost its position as a major power. So, what was the Swedish Empire? It was a pioneering example of a fiscal military state, a government model where a centralized bureaucracy is able to cooperate with local interest groups to effectively harvest resources and invest them into a standing army and navy. Since no other neighbor had adapted this government model, Sweden was able to dominate the Baltic Sea. After extensive conflicts with the Swedes, German princes, Denmark and Russia adapted these models of government. Denmark was able to survive as a sovereign nation, though it couldn't reclaim its lost territories. Brandenburg Prussia and Russia became two of Europe's greatest empires, and major political players to the modern day. Poland, the neighbor which failed to adapt, was conquered. Early modern Sweden is necessary to understand for several reasons. One, for the already mentioned reasons it played in founding these powerful empires. Secondly, that absolutism, military ferocity, and abundance of natural resources and coercion weren't vital in an effective government. Rather, cooperation and the organization of resources were the most important factors. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, propaganda and the illusion of self-rule are the most important factors of oppression. If you enjoy the content I produce, consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon. You'll find the link in the video description. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment, so that YouTube will show it to more potential viewers. And why not share it with a friend? Cheers.